Hey, how you doing? Since my last video, I hurt my arm really badly. I either stretched or tore the tendons in my right arm. My wife got kind of sick on Father's Day, June 17. I took her to the emergency room, and then they ended up admitting her for 3 days because her heart started to fail. So it's been a rough patch. And so if you go to my YouTube channel, scale phrase, lowercase s, ordinarily you'll find my series of videos in which I stress the 5-finger Stradella-bass accordion technique. In other words, I show you how to use all 5 fingers on the left-hand side of the 120 bass accordion. So you might be familiar with that. Anyway, but since I can't pick up the accordion right now, I thought I'd try to move on and share some of the other ideas that I've come up with. Now, as I mentioned on my other videos repeatedly, I did not come up with the 5-finger Stradella-bass technique. That was invented by Mr. Roberts, my accordion teacher, and he did that, let's say, in the 30s or 40s. I don't remember, but it was a long time ago. So I did not invent this. I can't take credit for that. I was just sharing what he showed me. But I did come up with my own ideas. 4 of those ideas I put in my book, which I did mention. And since my wife and I are in our mid to upper 60s now, we could drop over dead at any time. So I wanted to share as many ideas as possible before one of us drops over dead. And if you saw any of my other videos, you'll recall that I went over the Stradella reed recognition system, which I invented, Stradella reed recognition, and then I showed you my clef that I invented, the System C clef. It's a new clef that nobody's using right now, but maybe someday they might. And now I'd like to talk briefly about tone lining. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the accordion, but it's a system I thought up, and the reason why I thought about this is because I was, at some point I was writing music on my computer and with my Elisa synthesizer, and I used to try to do orchestral pieces and write music that was idiomatic. In other words, music that you could actually play on orchestral instruments. I wrote the parts such that the players could actually play the parts. In other words, they weren't some crazy synthesized stuff that was impossible to play. So I consulted many books. But while I was doing this, trying to figure out how to write orchestral music, my nature is to think about things, meditate, and look at things, and look into subjects or topics, and try to find something that somebody missed. That's the whole idea, the impetus behind my book. This book here, and don't run out and buy it, please. It's boring, and it's just about theory. It's not an accordion book. But I went back and read many, many books. Here's one of them. I still have it. A History of Western Music. I still have this. And I had other beautiful books, and I got rid of them, and I regret it now. But I looked and looked and looked to see if there was anything in Western music that was missed. Something that was overlooked, or just looking for something that somebody didn't say. And I found a few things, and I put them in the book, and that was the whole idea, to see if anybody over the past 800, 1,000 years missed a concept or something that was basically right in front of them. And I thought I found a few things. Well, one of those things, it sounds insignificant to you viewers, but I call it tone lining. Now, and what is that? Well, when you write lines of music for orchestra or a small ensemble, whatever, small, medium ensemble, or a full orchestra, you have to write it in a certain fashion. So I bought used books. Here's an orchestration book by Cox. This is a beautiful little old book. This is put out in 1928. This is just a joy to hold this book. And I got this book by Kennan, Orchestration. I got the Orchestration by Wagner. These are all beautiful books. Orchestration by Walter Piston. This is a classic. And I got this one I love because he's one of my favorite composers. Rimsky-Korsakov, Principles of Orchestration. Actually, this is the second copy of this. I got it. The first one I bought, it fell apart because the binding's crappy. So that's my second copy of that. And then I have this. I love this. Orchestration by Blatter. Alfred Blatter. Yeah, Alfred Blatter. This is a beautiful book. And Orchestration by Stephen Burton. I studied that. Anyway, and I had another one. I had one more by some guy. You can find it in the library. And I looked and looked and looked and looked to see if there's anything that they use or talk about, a standard term, a practice, a procedure that somebody might have missed. And the only thing I could find in all these books was there was a terminology problem. I thought it was a problem with terminology. In other words, they would refer to orchestral lines of music as doubling. They used the word doubling. You see, they would refer to unison doubling, or they would rephrase it as doubling in unison, or unison duplication. Okay. Then they talk about octave doubling. That's another thing they do, octave doubling, or they would call it doubling in octaves or octave duplication. All right, we'll get to that in a minute. And then they also had, in these books, you'll hear this or see this demonstrated, non-unison doubling and non-octave doubling. Okay? So when I would buy books, mostly from Dover, with orchestral scores in them so I could study them, I would notice that lines of music might be written for one part, and then that same line would be written an octave higher or an octave lower. And so that's why they use the term doubling, whether it be unison, octave, or non-unison or non-octave. Well, anyway, I looked at the music and I thought, this seems kind of weird because the doubling isn't really happening. So I went through the books, wrote my own music. I posted some songs on my channel here on YouTube, but nobody listens to them. They don't seem to like it, or maybe they don't like the fact that they're synthesized and might sound a little cheesy. But anyway, the point is I enjoy doing it. And I stopped doing it because I realized that this is a job for the professionals. Orchestral writing and all that good stuff. That's the job for the professionals, people who really know what they're doing. And so I gave it up and I conceded that I'm not a natural born composer and it's over and I feel good. So I get back into theory. Now, I came up with these ideas. I call them solo lining, unison lining, octave lining, parallel lining, and alternating lining. And I'll explain these. These are lining means writing lines of music or mapping out lines of music for any given instrument. It's called lining. In other words, writing lines of music. I only devote 2 pages of this in my book because there's not much to talk about, but I think it's valid. I think terminology-wise, I might have a good point. That's for you to decide. So now, if you start with the simplest form of music, the simplest delivery of music, you would have a solo. Okay? And a solo is roughly speaking, a musical composition for a single voice or single instrument with or without accompaniment. Okay? I'm pretty sure you know what that means. You've heard a solo instrument playing and you listen to the orchestra, and all of a sudden everybody stops, and this one flute guy goes off and starts playing something. That's a solo. Now, so I refer to writing lines of music, solo lines, all right? I refer to that as solo lining. It's very simple. Now, as an example, you can have a violin playing all by itself, okay? You have a violin playing a line of music, and that would be a true solo. Playing by itself would be a true solo. One instrument, one line of music, okay? And there's no accompaniment here. It would be just, in our example, just a violin with one line of sound. Now you can have, let's just say an oboe. An oboe is playing a line of sound. And then you have your, it's hard for me to see this. Let's say your violin section 1, violin section 2, viola, cello, bass. They're playing in the background, softly of course. And that would be solo lining, but there would be accompaniment. In other words, there would be some background harmonic structure to go along with that solo. And I just call that solo lining. You're writing a line of music for one instrument or one prominent melodic line. Okay? Now, the next thing is they refer to the music that they write as unison doubling. That's another thing. They say doubled in unison. They say that. Now, let's look at my example, how I perceive it. See, I call it unison lining. You can have flute number 1 and flute number 2 in your orchestral setup. And they're both playing the same exact line of music. They're reading the same notes. All right? So what that means is these are like instruments, and the composer says, I want the sound to be a little heavier, a little fuller, and so he has two instruments, two of the same kind of instruments playing the same line of music, and I call that unison lining. Now, going back to the old terminology, in other words, the terminology that I'm trying to get rid of, okay, trying to improve on, you can say, okay, unison doubling. Well, in the case of two flutes, that actually would be unison doubling in a sense, because you're doubling the notes played. So that would be accurate. But beyond that, you get into a mess. Now here's the next example would be a flute and a clarinet playing the same line of music, okay? Flute, one clarinet playing the same line of music. These are unlike instruments, all right? And not only is the sound going to be a little heavier, but it's going to be richer. It's going to be richer because of the tone colors. Each instrument has a certain tone color. Actually, the word used for many years was called timbre, but it's a tone color. So you have here flute and clarinet playing the same line of music, and I call it unison lining because they're playing in unison the same line of music. But if you say unison doubling, all right, you are not getting the same quality of sound from this instrument that you are with this instrument. You're not doubling that sound. You're not doubling a sound at the same quality or even the same dynamic. So this is where I like my choice of words, of terms better, because it's clear, especially for the new student, the little child learning orchestration, learning music. It's best to be as clear as possible, because later on when they get older, it's like politics and religion, then they don't have to unlearn some crap they were taught early on. They don't have to unlearn it. You see, that's a nice thing. Now, down here's another example. Violin section 1, that's the violin 1 section, all right? They're all playing the same notes, they're all playing the same thing. And in that violin section in the orchestra, you could have anywhere from, let's say, 1 to 16 violins. And they are all playing the same tone, meaning the same note, and giving the same tone. So here, in essence, you actually could have doubling of tones. But But that's only in relation to two instruments. Let's say there's 10 violins in this section. So you're not doubling the sound. You're having 9 duplications of the violin player in chair number 1. So it's not really doubling. You could say duplication, but then as we move on, you get into more trouble. Now here's another example. Violin 1, section 1, violin section 1, violin section 2. They'll play the same notes and it'll be fuller. It'll be great. Nice full sound. And if you have violin 1 and 2 sections, each with 10 violins, you're going to have 19 duplications of the violin in chair number 1. So doubling is a crappy word, and I use the word lining because you're just writing a line of music and you're playing it in unison. And then it doesn't matter how many people are playing the doggone note. It won't matter. Okay? Now, they refer to this thing called octave doubling, which I mentioned. Right? And we have a similar problem. Let's say we have here's my examples, the violin 1 section playing the soprano part. Let's just say roughly from C5 to B2, roughly. Then you had the violin 2 section playing the alto part, which is roughly C4 to B4. You know, it can go up and down, right? So I call it octave lining because the respective instruments are all playing the same line of music. And now we see that there isn't doubling of a given note. There is great number of multiplications. There's a great amount of duplication. And when they say octave doubling, what they're referring to is they're referring to somebody playing a line of music. Okay, let's say the violin 2 section plays a line of music here, and this section, violin, plays the same as plays that line an octave higher. They're not doubling these tones. It's a totally different tone. It's in a totally different range, a different voice. Doubling is a crappy word. Down here, for example, you could have cellos playing in the tenor range. All right, let's say C3 to B3. This is hard for me to see, by the way. And then the bass instruments playing in the bass range, let's say C2 to B2. And the bass players aren't doubling the tones of the cello players are playing. They're playing totally different tones. They're an octave higher. So you write an octave line of music, you write a line of music an octave higher. You don't need the word doubling and don't need the word duplication. I know this sounds like I'm neurotic and nitpicking, but this is what I do. I look for things in music and other areas, which I won't get into, that other people might have missed. Now let's move quickly to parallel lining. All right. Now, ordinarily, in the regular world of orchestral music, the professionals and such, they would call this non-unison doubling and non-octave doubling. Now, in my example, the first example, you have the first flute player and the second flute player, and they're playing lines of music that are at an interval of a third apart. They're a third apart, but the lines run parallel, except for certain sharps and flats, but basically they run parallel, and I call that parallel lines, because you're writing music that is parallel, lines that are parallel at a certain distance, in this case a third. Here you have, let's say we have the clarinet, first clarinet and second clarinet, and they're playing lines of music that are parallel, but their distance is a sixth. In other words, they're an interval of a sixth apart. But there's no doubling. You can't use the word doubling, and you can't use the word duplication. It's idiotic. Now here's another example. You have, let's say, the cello players playing a line, and then at a distance of a third apart, the violin section, number 1, would play a line that's a third apart from the cello, and then the violin 2 section could play a line of music that's a sixth apart, an interval of a sixth apart from the cello. And what we have here is you're going to harmonically thicken, all right, that original line of music. That's the purpose. But still, the key thing here is I'm talking about terminology, and I'm going as fast as I can. Please bear with me. So I call that parallel lining. Now, then finally I have what I call alternating lining or alternating instrument lining. In other words, you're writing a line of music, let's say for a clarinet, and then the flute picks up that line of that prominent melodic line, all right, picks it up, takes it, and runs with it, and then the oboe takes it, and so on and so forth. Like down here, for example, you could have the first violin section playing it, and then the violas take over, then the cellos take over. And what we have here is we have a change in tone color, and probably because of the way they play the instrument itself, you could have a change in the weight of the sound. And then also you have a change in luminosity. You have certain clarity and certain harmonics, and each instrument will come out and be prominent. That's how you can tell a flute from a trumpet, because of the harmonics, the way the instrument's built. The harmonics, and that's another story I'll get into in a future video, is what determines why an instrument sounds the way it does. Anyway, I went fast because I'm sure some people think my videos are boring, but I wanted to take yet another standard practice that people are familiar with and use repeatedly, and show that maybe the terminology or maybe the thinking or the perspective of that procedure could be improved a little bit, could be polished a little bit. And again, I know people think I'm neurotic and real fussy in particular, but later on, if I do philosophical videos or God forbid political, watch the haters all come out, you'll see that people speak all the time, daily. They speak about things, and they use terms, and they use phrasings, and they use even diction, and it makes you and leads you to believe that something is something that it really isn't. And that's why being precise is very important, especially when you're teaching little children. I learned that when my wife and I homeschooled our children. I look back and I thought, wow, I was a great teacher. I was doing great stuff. And I look back and I see, boy, I made 1,000 mistakes, and it wasn't all that great. But anyway, that's it. I apologize for taking so long, but now I've showed you Stradella reed recognition. I think I did 3 videos on that. I showed you my system C clef, 2 videos, and now you know tone lining, and you'll probably forget it, and that's it. And then if I'm still alive, I'll come back and do my last 2, and then see what happens. That's it. Thank you very much for being patient, and I hope you benefit a little bit from this. Good night.